Welcome. I hope you're having a good day. This is the third lecture on German institutions. Hard to believe this is my 83rd recording overall for my American government and global politics courses. Today I want to talk about the Bundestag, and I want to come back to the theme that I've kind of been underlying when I've been talking about Germany, and that is you see elements of both the American political system and the British political system when you take a look at the German legislature. So the Bundestag is the lower house of the German political system. The areas, and I'll talk more about this later, there are two areas that stand out for me that look very American about the German national legislature. The first is that the Bundestag is really known for its strong committee work. They really do, sometimes it's called a legal or law factory. The Germans do a lot of their work in these standing committees, just like the American Congress has very, very powerful. In fact, American committees, in my mind, are even stronger than German committees. But Germany is the country in Europe that looks the closest to the United States in terms of its committee work. The second area where the German legislature looks like the American Congress is that Germany actually does have a meaningful upper house, the Bundesrat. In Britain and in France, there was an upper house, the House of Lords, remember, in Britain, and the Senate in France, but both were very weak legislatures, and both could be cast aside easily by the lower house. In the case of Germany, even though the Bundesrat is not equal to the Bundestag, it has significant power and can veto a significant amount of legislation. And they actually do propose, it's not a large amount, maybe 10% of legislation starts in the Bundesrat, but certainly having a meaningful upper house makes Germany look very, very rare in Europe and a lot more like the United States. Now, on the other hand, the German legislature looks a lot like Britain. The deputies of the Bundestag are the only directly elected officials at the national level in the German system, just like in Britain, members to the House of Commons are the only directly elected officials at the national level. Just like in Britain, where the House of Commons is at the center of public policy making, that is also true in Britain. Party discipline in both countries is very, very high. Between 85 and 90% of votes are straight party votes, which means that all the members of one political party are voting against all of the members of the other party. There are occasional what we would call free votes. They're rare. And a free vote is exactly what its name implies. It's not tricky. This is where party leaders allow their members to vote based on their own convictions or what they think. And often there is no ideology attached to a free vote. And I will just illustrate that. It's in your notes. The most famous example of this since German reunification was a vote in terms of, now that we have reunified, what should the capital of our unified country be? Now, keep in mind that during the Cold War, before reunification, the capital of West Germany was in Bonn. And so should the capital stay in Bonn, or should the capital be moved to its historical, traditional kind of capital, Berlin? And all of the political parties turned their individual deputies free and said, this is a difficult vote. We're not going to take a position on this. And so if you were to go and look up that vote, you will notice that there are votes for each city from a variety of political parties. And that's because the parties did not tell their deputies which way to vote. And of course, Berlin won that vote. Bundestag members serve a 4-year term of office. There are no term limits. Deputies only have to be 18 years of age. So basically, the thought is if you are old enough to vote, you are old enough to be a deputy in the Bundestag. One thing to put some stars next to, and I didn't, because this is a question you're likely to see in one form or another. Like in Great Britain, the legislature can be dissolved early, and new elections can be called. But this occurs far less frequently in Germany than in Britain. And in fact, since 1949, this has only happened 3 times in Germany and has occurred many more times than that. Remember, Mrs. Thatcher called for elections early twice, and so did Tony Blair. So there's 4 cases of that just by 2 prime ministers. Theresa May did this. Lots of prime ministers in Britain have done this. Very, very rare in Britain. So even though both have this power, political culture, custom has meant that the 2 leaders of these countries take very different approaches to it. Like in Britain, the executive branch gets a high percentage of its legislation passed. And I looked for a newer number because I will admit up front this is a really old number. I looked for about 30 minutes and didn't find I found particular years, but I couldn't find like a whole term of office. If someone goes out there and doesn't have anything to do and wants to email me an update on this, it's fine. But I think it illustrates it. It's going to vary a little bit based on number. It's going to vary a little bit, but the numbers are so overwhelming that it resembles Britain. Remember, I told you since World War II, the prime minister has gotten about 96.6% of their legislation passed, and that's over a lengthy period of time. That's from 1945 to 2015. That's a 70-year period. In this case, I'm just going to use one of Helmut Kohl's terms from 1983 to 1987. Chancellor Kohl and the cabinet introduced 280 bills to the Bundestag, and 273 of them were passed. So that looks an awful lot like the success rate in Britain, 273 out of 280. And the government does propose a majority of the legislation that is introduced in the Bundestag. And if they introduce legislation, because of that strict party discipline that exists in the German system, and to be fair, in the British system, they're going to get their legislation passed. Once again, very different than the American political system. Our political system is designed not to get things done. Our political system was built on bargaining and compromise, and frankly, as I've mentioned and complained many times about, our party leaders really aren't about bargaining and compromising. In fact, if you do illustrate or go out and say that you want to bargain or compromise, the voters get very, very upset about this. We have created tremendous tribalism in our political system. In a system like Britain or Germany, that's fine. That's fine because the majority party can govern and the minority party can serve as a loyal opposition and as an alternative. In the United States, however, because of checks and balances and separation of powers, it is difficult even for a majority to govern unless they have a supermajority. If they have, for example, 60 votes in the Senate, and you control a majority of the House, and you control the presidency, well then, in America, you can basically pass whatever you want. But it has been quite some time since we've had that kind of parameter there. The Bundestag also elects half of the Constitutional Court. I'll talk about that later. The Bundestag frames legislation. In theory, they give kind of broad edicts. When I say supervises the bureaucracy in there, I probably should have said has oversight over the bureaucracy, because of course it is the cabinet that directly supervises the bureaucracy. So I apologize for that. You may want to cross that word out, although I'm not going to take an exam question from there, so you probably don't have to worry about that. In the German system, a lot of Bundestag members come from the civil service and business associations. There's also an awful lot of attorneys represented in the Bundestag. Now, I want to update something that's in Roskin. I'm not saying that Roskin is wrong, because certainly if I were writing the textbook when Roskin did, I would have pointed the same thing out. But I do want to point out that something has happened in the last Bundestag election in 2017 that reversed this trend. So Roskin points out that about a third, in fact, in 2013, I believe it was 37% of Bundestag members were female, so it was over a third. But what's interesting is in the 2017 election, there was a significant decrease in the number of women represented in the Bundestag. So the current Bundestag membership, the current percentage of females in the Bundestag has declined to 31%, which is a 19-year low. And the primary reason for this, in my opinion, is that in this election, we saw a right-wing nationalist party represented in the Bundestag for the first time in the post-World War II era. So I listed some numbers. I went out and did some research. You don't need to know the numbers. If I ask you about what percentage of members of the Bundestag are females, I'll probably have 31% as an answer. I may have, if I just do fractions, a quarter, a third, a half, or 2/3. And if I did that, then it would be closest to a third. But notice in Germany, like we see in the United States, the leftist parties have far greater female representation than right-wing parties. The liberals have more women represented in the legislature than do the conservatives. So in America, the vast majority of congresswomen are Democrats. The Republicans don't have nearly as many. And we see this in Germany. So if you take a look at Angela Merkel, so here we have a female leader. She has headed the Christian Democrats, Christian Socialists. She's been the chancellor since 2005, and yet her party only has 19.9% female representation in the Bundestag, far less than the socialists, who 41.8% of their deputies are female. Or if you take a look and I left something out there after the Green Party where it says 53.6%. You may want to put the Greens. The Green Party has 53.6%. More than half of Green deputies are women. If you look at the Left Party, which are the former communists, people who are very left-wing socialists or communists, almost 61%, 60.9% of their deputies are women. Even the Free Democrats, which are the party that looks closest to an American party, the Free Democrats look somewhat like the Republican Party, although they're perhaps a little bit different, and I'll talk about that. So the only party that has fewer female representatives is the AfD party, a far right-wing Alternative for Germany party, a new party that was founded only in 2013. They narrowly missed the 5% threshold, so they did not get any representation in 2013. But in 2017, they passed that threshold, and less than 12% of their deputies are female. To conclude the Bundestag, I would say, like the United States, the German Bundestag has highly specialized committees. The committee system and the prevalence of coalition governments give the Bundestag more independence than the House of Commons. The major distinction I would make, and it's not in the book, is that in Germany, bills cannot be killed in committees like in the United States.